It was 1971, the time of the Vietnam War, the day that changed my grandparents' lives forever. They'd recently just gotten married. At the time, my grandfather was a teacher and my grandma was working at a department store. It was a regular day and my grandma was at work when she started to feel sick, so she went to the doctors to see what was wrong. The doctors believed it was an ulcer, so they gave her some medicine and told her she would be fine as long as she rested. The next day she went to her sister's house. She didn't think it was just a stomach problem. Her sister was sure she was pregnant. "I think you're pregnant," said her sister. "What?" said my grandma. She was in disbelief. Her sister told her to go back to the doctor and get tested, so unwillingly that's what my grandma did. It was a Saturday morning. My grandma went to the doctor and my grandpa was playing handball at Bournemouth Seminary with some of his friends. She had dropped him off early that morning and went to find out if she was really pregnant. Back then, it took a lot longer to get the results, so she still did not know after the appointment. When they were both finished, my grandma went back to pick up my grandfather. As they were walking back into their apartment, my grandpa was getting their mail, and my grandma went inside because she could hear the phone ringing from outside their room. As my grandpa was walking in with a single letter in his hand, my grandma had gotten the news. With the phone still in her hand, she said, "I'm pregnant." Almost the exact same time my grandpa said, "I've been drafted to the Vietnam War." They were stunned. "We were really, really upset," said my grandma. They did not know what they were going to do. At the time, my grandpa was 22 and my grandma was 21. Luckily, my grandpa was a teacher, so he was allowed to go later after the school year was over. This was called a deferment. At the time, my grandpa was also in law school, so he got into a JAG unit of the reserves. This was a reserve unit for the lawyers. That is the reason my grandpa did not go to Vietnam. The reserve unit he was in was stationed in Virginia, which is still far away from their home in Cleveland. He was able to drive home on the weekends, but sadly my grandma went into labor on a Tuesday. That morning she was playing cards with her neighbors and her back started to hurt. The neighbors told her to go to the hospital because she was going into labor, but again she denied it, even though it was 10 days after her due date. She tried to go to sleep that night, but she couldn't, so she called her sister to take her to the hospital. It wasn't for hours into labor at the hospital that the doctors decided to do a C-section. My grandpa was still in Virginia at the time, but the doctors said they contacted him. So the Army Reserves let him leave to go see his wife and by now first child. My grandpa started the long drive home, but on his way something unexpected happened. He was on the edge of a hurricane. It was Hurricane Irene. As stubborn as he was, he thought he could drive through it. He was wrong. Another struggle came along. He ran out of gas in the middle of a hurricane. Luckily, a nice couple saw him in his uniform and decided to pick him up and take him to the hospital. When he finally arrived, they had another problem. "What do we name him?" said my grandma. They thought long and hard. My grandpa had one name in mind. The story behind that name is that my grandpa's first year of teaching, he had a student who had polio, but that didn't stop him. Despite his disability, he excelled at anything he put his mind to. That boy's name was Brian. My grandparents wanted their firstborn to have these same characteristics growing up. So that's what they named him, Brian Carl Bellinger, my dad. And if you were wondering, it worked. My dad is attempting to run a 100-mile race in Texas this February that he has been training for long and hard all year. When my grandma first told me this story, I learned that in life you will run into many struggles. For example, my grandma had to overcome being away from her husband, which is very difficult in general, but being pregnant makes it even harder. Also, at the time my grandpa went to the reserves, he had to quit his job, leaving little money for my grandma, who also could not work because of her pregnancy. After all that, my dad was finally born. This taught me to keep a positive attitude even when in stressful situations. Because like in this story, you will get your happy ending eventually. It never occurred to me that if I never would have asked my grandma about this story, most likely it would have never been told. That day I asked about the story. It was Thanksgiving, so I was with many family members. It was just after we ate dinner, and I asked my grandma if she had an interesting story to tell me. She had to think for a while, but once she got started telling the story, she went on and on telling story after story about her life and my dad's life. Sitting there surrounded by my family listening to the good old days was a really good experience. I'm very glad I asked because I learned many new things about my dad that I never knew, and neither did my mom. For example, when my dad and his brother were babies, my dad poured a huge bag of baby powder on himself and his brother and ran down the street naked, covered in the powder. We all had a good laugh about that one. Now I can keep these stories alive.